Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a claim that sits at the very heart of Grey Knight's lore, a claim so bold, so absolute, so apparently unassailable that it functions almost like a founding principle, a philosophical cornerstone that the entire identity of the chapter rests upon. And it goes like this. In over 10,000 years of service to the God Emperor of mankind, not a single Grey Knight has ever been corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos. Not one. Not ever. Not once. In 10,000 years. Take a moment with that. Let it settle. 10,000 years is not a number that means much to us on an intuitive level, because our entire recorded history barely scratches a fraction of it. 10,000 years ago, human beings were still building the earliest cities on Earth. We had not yet invented writing. So we were drawing animals on cave walls with ochre and charcoal. And in the 41st millennium of the Imperium's existence, the Grey Knights have been fighting their hidden war for the entirety of that incomprehensible span. And in all of it, every campaign, every demonic incursion, every descent into the Eye of Terror, every ritual that required handling weapons with demon souls bound inside them, every tome of forbidden knowledge pored over by librarians who needed to know the enemy's secrets well enough to use them, not one Grey Knight has cracked. Not one has opened the door, however slightly. Not one has said yes. That is an extraordinary claim. And in Warhammer 40,000 of all settings, a universe where even the greatest of heroes can be broken, is where Primarchs themselves knelt before the dark gods and gave their legions over to ruin, where 10,000 years of pressure grinds everything down eventually. An extraordinary claim demands a very, very close look, because here is what the Grey Knights actually do. They handle demon weapons. They read texts that would liquefy the sanity of ordinary scholars. They walk into environments so saturated with warp corruption that ordinary space marines, even veteran ones, sometimes emerge psychically scarred. They face greater demons in single combat. They perform rites that require a direct and deliberate engagement with the Imperium, reaching into the stuff of the warp and pulling power from it, shaping it with their minds into something that can hurt what they are fighting. They do all of this constantly, as a job, or as the thing they were made to do. And in 10,000 years of doing it, no one has broken. So when you hear that, the natural question, the question that anyone drawn to lore deep enough to end up here has probably already thought about is, wait, really? Is that actually true? Or is it the kind of thing the Imperium says about itself because the truth is more complicated? The answer, as it turns out, is both. And unpacking that answer takes us through one of the most fascinating, most carefully constructed, and most philosophically rich corners of all of 40,000 lore. Let us just appreciate the scale of what this claim represents before we start examining its edges. The Horus Heresy, the thing the Grey Knights were specifically built to prevent from happening again, claimed 8 Primarchs, 8 of the 20, not minor figures. It's not warriors of middling quality who broke under ordinary pressure, beings of near godlike power and intelligence, crafted by the Emperor himself, who had led legions across the galaxy for decades, and who should, by any reasonable calculation, have been among the most spiritually resilient entities the human species had ever produced. And the Dark Gods took 8 of them, found the specific fractures in their specific natures, and pressed until the fractures became chasms. After the heresy, the pressure never stopped. The Eye of Terror vomits chaos warbands into real space constantly. Every Black Crusade brings new legions of warriors who once carried the Emperor's colours and now carry the symbols of his enemies. Entire chapters of post-heresy space marines have fallen. The Astral Claws, the Soul Drinkers, the Crimson Slaughter and a dozen others choose less famous. The history of the Imperium in the 10,000 years since the heresy is peppered with examples of the apparently incorruptible having been corrupted, of the absolutely loyal having been turned, of the most carefully trained warriors having found something in the warp's offerings that mattered to them more than their oaths. Against this background, 10,000 years of evidence that corruption is not an exceptional event, but a recurring fact of Imperial life. The Grey Knights have maintained an unbroken record. Not a single failure, not a single defection, not one warrior in the chapter's history, across thousands of individuals serving across millennia, has crossed to the other side. That is the claim. And it is worth taking seriously on its own terms before we start looking at what sits around its edges. Because there is a Grey Knight, a purifier no less, the elite of the elite, the souls specifically chosen from among these already extraordinary warriors for the particular quality of their incorruptibility, whose mind was shattered and whose body was turned against his brothers, a man named Saden. And his story, when you examine it carefully, does not shatter the claim of Grey Knight incorruptibility, but it does something more interesting than that. It reveals exactly where the edges of that incorruptibility lie, exactly what it was built to resist, and exactly what it was never designed to account for. Tonight we are going to take the full journey. We will start at the very beginning, why the Grey Knights were created, and how they were built, what makes them different from every other Space Marine chapter in the Imperium. We will walk through the training they endure, the protections they carry, the philosophy behind their specific kind of immunity. We will talk about the purifiers and what makes them special even among their already extraordinary peers. We will sit with the story of Saden and the Blade of Purity and think through what it actually means. We will look at Kaldor Drago, wandering the warp for subjective centuries and somehow still himself. And we will look at the Months of Shame, the chapter of Grey Knight's history where the incorruptibility held, but the moral compass cracked, and billions of innocent people died for it. At the end of all that, we will ask the question directly, can a Grey Knight actually fall? And I will tell you what I actually think, after sitting with the lore long enough. Get comfortable, turn the volume up just slightly, let the weight of 10,000 years settle around you. This is going to take a while, and every bit of it is worth the time. To understand why Saden's fall, whatever we ultimately decide to call it, carries the weight it does, you first need to understand what the Grey Knights actually are. Not superficially, not just the silver armor and the force weapons and the demon hunting brief. The deeper thing, the reason they exist, the specific kind of answer they were designed to be to a specific kind of problem. That problem crystallized during the worst period in all of recorded human history. Not the Long Night, not the wars of unification, but not even the grinding horror of the Siege of Terror in isolation, but the full, terrible arc of the Horus heresy itself. The great fracturing of everything the Emperor had spent 30 years of the Great Crusade building. Here is the thing about the Horus heresy that is easy to lose in the scale of the story. The Emperor did not simply have soldiers who turned against him. He had sons who turned against him. Primarchs, created beings of superhuman power and intellect, shaped by the Emperor's own genetic science and psychic craft to be the captains of his dream. The finest minds and most powerful warriors the Imperium had ever produced. And 8 of them, with their legions, broke. That breaking was not accidental. It was engineered by the Chaos Gods, patiently, over decades, finding the specific weakness in each Primarch's extraordinary nature, and pressing on it until something gave. Horus was broken through his pride and his ambition, and a wound that should not have been survivable. Magnus was broken through his love of knowledge, and the Emperor's seeming betrayal of him. Angron was broken through the rage-amplifying implants put into his skull against his will, organs that made his entire existence a constant agony of bloodlust. Mortarion was broken through generations of suffering and a bitter resentment that had been growing since before the Imperium existed. Each of them had a crack. The Chaos Gods found it, and the Emperor, looking at the ruin of his greatest creations, understood something that must have been devastating to acknowledge. The Space Marines were not immune to this. The greatest soldiers he had ever made, the transhuman warriors who were supposed to be the sword of his vision, corruptible, demonstrably, catastrophically corruptible. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough to take 8 legions into darkness and nearly topple everything. So he looked forward, even in the middle of the heresy, even as terror itself was being threatened, he looked at what was coming after and understood that the war against chaos would not end when Horus was defeated. Chaos is not a political movement you can decapitate. It is not an army you can destroy. It is the spiritual pollution of the universe itself, the shadow cast by mortal emotion in the Imperium, given shape and will and a hunger that does not stop. Even if Horus fell, the dark gods would still be there. As the Eye of Terror would still belch demons. Heretics would still make their bargains. The tide would still press in. And so he needed something new. Not just stronger, different. Something that could stand in the worst the warp had to offer and remain standing not through armor or weapons or sheer power, but through something more fundamental than any of those things. Something in their bones, something in their souls. He turned to the one person he trusted completely with the specifics of how to build it. Malcador the Sigillite. Malcador is worth pausing on because he is one of the most underexplored and most important figures in all of 40,000 lore. He was ancient, truly ancient, his exact origins shrouded in deliberate mystery. It was his history predating the Great Crusade by so long that by the time the Horus heresy began, he had already spent centuries at the Emperor's side. He was the second most powerful human psyker who had ever existed, by some accounts. He was the Emperor's closest confidant, his most trusted advisor, the man who had sat at his right hand through the Unification Wars and the founding of the Imperium, and everything that had followed. If the Emperor is the architect of the Imperium's grand design, Malcador was the engineer who understood how every individual piece was supposed to fit together. More than that, he understood people. He understood souls. And when the Emperor gave him the most important commission of the entire heresy, find the foundations of a new kind of warrior, he went about it with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly how difficult the task was and exactly what was at stake if he got it wrong. His mandate was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. Find 12 individuals of truly extraordinary quality, not warriors of exceptional skill. Those were everywhere in the Imperium, even in the middle of the heresy. Not psychers of great power. Again, not rare enough. Find 12 people whose souls were fundamentally clean, who had looked at chaos directly, with full knowledge of what it was, and come away unchanged, who possessed a quality of spirit that made them resistant not just to corruption's obvious forms, but to its subtle ones. But the quiet whisper, the beautiful lie, the gift that comes wrapped in shadow. 8 of those 12 were Space Marines, drawn from various legions both loyal and traitorous, though all of the chosen had personally remained loyal to the Emperor even when their legions had broken. Think about what that means. Some of the founding Grey Knights came from legions that had fallen to chaos, watched their brothers turn and chose not to, were surrounded by corruption and did not yield. The quality that made them unsuitable for their own legions was exactly the quality Malcador was looking for. The other 4 were human lords and administrators, people of extraordinary intelligence, moral clarity, and strength of will who would go on to lay the groundwork for what eventually became the Inquisition. So they carried the institutional memory and the political frameworks while the Space Marines carried the weapons. With these 12 in hand, Malcador took the 8 Space Marines to a place Bulbas already prepared for them, Saturn's largest moon, Titan, a world of liquid methane seas and ice sheets and crushing cold, already equipped with a fully functioning fortress monastery carved from basalt, filled with cryovolted gene seed, stocked with provisions, and populated with hundreds of thousands of carefully pre-selected recruits brought from across the Imperium. These recruits were themselves extraordinary, their minds already probed for the slightest trace of chaos taint, their psychic potential already assessed, their inner quality already measured against the extraordinarily high bar that Malcador had set. As this had all been built without anyone in the wider galaxy knowing about it, prepared in secret, ready and waiting for exactly this moment. And then Malcador did something that no one else in the Imperium had the psychic power to do, and few would have had the courage to attempt even if they could. He hid Titan in the warp, not beside the warp, not in a shielded pocket at its edge, inside it. He wrapped the entire moon in macrogellar fields and personal sigillic wards of his own devising, and he pushed it sideways out of reality, into the Imperium, into the churning spiritual sea that is simultaneously the most dangerous and the most powerful place in the universe. While the siege of terror played out above terror, and the Emperor walked through the corridors of the vengeful spirit, and everything that could possibly go wrong did go wrong in rapid succession, Titan drifted in the warp, protected, hidden, building something. Time flows differently in the warp than it does in real space. This is one of those facts about the 40,000 universe that never quite loses its strangeness no matter how often you encounter it. What was years outside became decades inside that hidden cyst. The 8 original founders, later called the Titans by Malcador, for each of their names echoed the ancient Terran mythological figures, had time. Time to build. Time to train. Time to think through every detail of what they were creating. She had time to develop the doctrines and the rituals and the psychic techniques and the weapons that would define their chapter forever. And when Titan finally slipped back into reality during the second founding, when it crossed back from the warp into the physical universe as the legions were being divided into chapters in accordance with the new Codex Astartes, it did not arrive with 8 exhausted space marines and a crowd of neophytes still finding their footing. It arrived with a full chapter, 1,000 trained, equipped, tested, and ready Grey Knights, forged in the interior of the warp itself, psychic warriors of extraordinary power who had spent their formative years inside the very thing they were built to fight. The newly established Inquisition, inheritor of those 4 human lords Malcador had chosen, quietly slotted them into the list of second founding chapters as number 666. The number was deliberate. Everything about the Grey Knights is deliberate. Now let us talk about the gene seed, because this is where the Grey Knights diverge from every other Space Marine chapter in a way that goes beyond simple specialization or tactical doctrine. This is where they are, at a biological and psychic level, built from fundamentally different material. Every other chapter draws its genetic heritage from one of the 20 Primarchs. You carry Sanguinius in your blood if you are a Blood Angel. You carry Lehman Russ if you are a Space Wolf. The gene seed shapes everything, the physical quirks, the psychological tendencies, the unique strengths and vulnerabilities that define each chapter's culture. It is inheritance in the most literal sense. Would you receive not just the physiological templates for the transformation into a Space Marine, but the echoes of whoever the gene seed came from, the weight of their nature, the shadow of their flaws. The Primarchs were extraordinary, but they were not clean. Several of them had been touched by the warp before they even reached maturity, scattered to the corners of the galaxy as infants, exposed to environments that left marks. The gene seeds derived from them carry these marks in diffuse, unpredictable ways. Sometimes those marks express as the chapter's culture, their tendency towards certain emotions or beliefs. Sometimes they express more directly. The Blood Angels' red thirst, the Space Wolves' Canis Helix, the Black Templars' near-religious fervor that borders on obsession. The Grey Knights carry none of this. And according to the law, carefully, thoughtfully hedged with a language like is believed and is suspected, because the chapter guards its own secrets as zealously as it guards everything else. The Grey Knight's gene seed comes from the Emperor himself, not filtered through a Primarch, not derived from one of the 20, directly from the source, the most powerful human psyker who ever existed, whose genetic structure was itself something that defied ordinary biological understanding. The chapter refers to their implants as the Emperor's gift. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They actually believe, and their belief is supported by enough evidence that the broader Inquisition treats it as probable fact that what was put into them came from the Emperor's own genome, refined and prepared specifically for them. Well, what does this mean in practice? It means that every Grey Knight is a psyker, not some of them, not the ones who happen to manifest the gift. Every single one. This is unique among Space Marine chapters, where psychic ability is relatively rare, even in already transhuman warriors. It also means that the psychic gift manifest differently, more precisely tuned to a specific application, cleaner in some quality that regular Astartes psychers describe, but cannot fully articulate. There is something in the Grey Knight's psychic presence that is not just powerful, but fundamentally different in character, less wild, more exact, like the difference between a large fire and a precisely focused flame. There is a deeper implication as well, so one that the lore approaches carefully because it gets into territory that 40k likes to keep ambiguous. The Emperor's nature as a soul and as a psychic entity may be something that actively resists the Dark Gods in a way that no Primarch-derived gene seed can replicate. The Primarchs were magnificent, but they were created in a specific way at a specific time, under conditions that even the Emperor acknowledged were not ideal. Rushed, incorporating warp elements formed in haste during periods of political and military pressure. The Grey Knight's gene seed may be what the Emperor made when he finally had the time and the clarity to make exactly what he wanted. Whether this gene seed is the primary source of their incorruptibility, or whether it is the training or the aegis, or some combination of all of these things, the lore leaves left open. And that ambiguity is interesting rather than frustrating, because it means the Grey Knight's protection is not a simple thing with a simple explanation. It is a system, and systems, as we will see, have gaps that no one anticipated when they were designed. So you have these extraordinary warriors with their extraordinary gene seed. Now you need to train them, and the training the Grey Knights undergo is by any reasonable standard the most demanding, most psychically intensive, and most philosophically serious preparation for war that any warrior in the Imperium receives. It makes standard Space Marine training look gentle by comparison. Recruitment itself is filtered through a process that other chapters do not use. So most Grey Knight recruits come from the Black Ships, those massive dark vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that travel the Imperium's worlds, scooping up psychers who would otherwise burn out, go mad, be consumed by demons, or accidentally tear holes in reality in their sleep. The Black Ships bring these psychers to Terra, where most of them face grim fates, their spiritual energy harvested to sustain the Emperor on the Golden Throne, or processed into sanctioned psychers under the strict oversight of the Scholastica Psychana, or judged unsuitable for any use and dealt with accordingly. But before that process runs its full course, a small number are quietly intercepted, diverted, taken not to Terra but to Titan by agents called Gatherers who serve the Grey Knights. And sometimes the chapter takes recruits from other sources, from untithed psyker populations on worlds outside standard Imperial jurisdiction, from feral worlds considered off-limits to ordinary citizens, and occasionally, controversially, directly from the recruitment pools of other Space Marine chapters, often without those chapters' knowledge or permission. The only consistent criteria are psychic potential and what the Gatherers assess as exceptional mental and spiritual fortitude. Once on Titan, the testing begins. And this is not the merely grueling physicality that defines other chapters' selection processes. Other chapters test whether a body can survive. The Grey Knights test whether a soul can. The centerpiece of this process is the 666 rituals of detestation. 666 rituals. Is each one designed to test a specific quality, expose a specific potential weakness, strip away a specific layer of ordinary human psychology and see what remains underneath? Many of these rituals involve direct and deliberately dangerous exposure to the things the aspirant will spend his life fighting. Demons are brought before him, contained, bound, prevented from acting in the material sense, but present, psychically present. Their attention focused on the candidate. The warp responds to focused attention. When a demon looks at you, it is not merely seeing you in the physical sense. It is reading you, reaching for the threads in your psychic presence that can be pulled, the resonances that can be amplified, the fears and desires and wounds that can be used. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal psychic process that every psyker who spends time near warp entities eventually experiences. And what the 666 rituals do, in essence, is give demons a very long, very uninterrupted, very carefully monitored opportunity to try this on every candidate in turn. The candidate must pass all 666 of them, not survive them, pass them. There is a difference. Surviving a demon's attention means you are still alive at the end. Passing it means the demon finds nothing to work with. No crack in the wall, no loose stone, no frequency it can resonate with. The candidate must demonstrate over and over and over again that there is simply no door in him that can be opened. Most people who attempt this fail. Many die. At the selection ratio for the Grey Knights, roughly 1 warrior for every 1,000 produced across the broader Astartes, is not a reflection of physical standards that could not be met. It is a reflection of the reality that the specific quality being tested for is vanishingly rare, completely unteachable, and entirely absolute. Either you have the soul that the 666 rituals cannot crack, or you do not. And if you do not, no amount of training and preparation can manufacture it in you. The ones who pass are extraordinary in a way that goes beyond their physical capabilities. They have looked at the worst the warp can bring to bear on a mortal soul and come away unchanged. They have demonstrated, under controlled but genuine test conditions, that the specific kind of corruption the Grey Knights were built to resist cannot find purchase in them. They are, in this very specific and very important sense, proven, but passing the 666 rituals is not the end. It is barely the beginning. Once a recruit has proven himself worthy of the chapter, something happens that has no real parallel in any other Space Marine training process. His memories are taken from him, not partially dimmed or reduced in emotional weight, not filed away behind conditioning that makes them hard to access, erased, surgically removed through a combination of the most advanced psychosurgery available and psychic techniques that only the Grey Knights possess. The recruit who goes through this process loses the majority of his personal history, his family, his childhood, his name, but the emotional landscape of who he was before he came to Titan is simply gone, as if it never existed. He receives a new name. And here the Grey Knights reveal another layer of how deeply they think about the metaphysics of what they are doing. Each Grey Knight name is not merely a designation. It is a precisely constructed fragment of magical lore, a word of power specifically calibrated to act in opposition to the true name of a particular demon. The name is a weapon. The warrior carries it literally like a ward. When he speaks his name, he is invoking something. When a demon hears his name, it resonates against something the demon finds uncomfortable. Even in this apparently mundane aspect of identity, the Grey Knights have converted something human into something martial. As the erasure of memory serves multiple interconnected purposes, demons are patient, infinitely, terrifyingly patient. They operate on timescales that make human lifespans look like afterthoughts. And they are thorough in a way that defies comfortable description. They will find a memory that was made when you were 6 years old, on a morning that meant nothing to you, and has not crossed your mind in decades. And they will press on it with surgical precision until it becomes a wedge that splits you open. A face, a fear, a moment of weakness, a person you loved who you failed, an ambition you had and buried. These are the things demons use. These are the handholds they find and exploit. By removing the past, the Grey Knights remove the handholds. What remains is the warrior in his essential form, stripped to his purpose, a rebuilt around loyalty, trained in the psychic arts, and sealed at every level from the skin inward with protective wards. Hexagrammic and pentagrammic sigils are inscribed not just on the armor, but beneath the flesh itself, tattooed onto bone, and embedded in tissue. The body becomes a ward. The nervous system becomes a circuit for protective power. And then there is the aegis. The aegis deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is the single most important thing about the Grey Knights, more important than the weapons, more important than the armor, more important in some ways than even the gene seed. It is the defining characteristic, the thing that makes a Grey Knight what he is. The aegis is a halo of psychic protection, a shimmering, burning, we constantly maintain a barrier of focused will and channel power that a Grey Knight learns to sustain from the moment his training reaches the advanced stages, and which he never again allows to lapse. It is not a ward that someone else places on him. It is not an external protection he relies on. It is something he generates from within himself, using his own psychic power, sustaining it through the ongoing exercise of his own will. It is an active, living, breathing thing that requires his constant attention and energy, and which he maintains during sleep, during combat, during rest, during ritual, and during the quiet moments between. One useful way to think about the aegis is to compare it to the ordinary faith that regular Space Marines and Imperial Guard soldiers rely on in spiritual combat. But faith in the Emperor is not nothing in the 40,000 universe. It is quantifiably real, demonstrably effective, and operates according to principles that the warp recognizes. A Space Marine whose devotion is genuine is harder to corrupt than one whose devotion is performative. A sister of battle whose faith burns bright enough can manifest phenomena that should not be possible by any natural law. Faith is a genuine protective force in the 40k universe. But faith, even the most sincere and powerful faith, is still reactive. It is a shield you hold up against incoming pressure. It is something you sustain by maintaining your belief, by continuing to choose the thing you have committed to, by not letting doubt or despair or the accumulated weight of terrible things become strong enough to make you choose differently. Yet even the strongest faith is something you can lose under sufficiently extreme circumstances if the pressure against it is overwhelming enough and sustained for long enough. History across both the real world and the 40k universe is full of people whose faith was sincere and strong and ultimately insufficient. The aegis is not faith in this sense. It is something more like an immune system than a shield. It does not wait for an attack to respond to. It does not require a choice to sustain it under pressure, because it is not contingent on the ongoing act of choosing. It is a structural feature of the Grey Knight's psychic presence, as fundamental to what he is as his gene seed enhancements or his Astartes physiology. You cannot wear it down by attacking his faith, because it does not run on faith in the way that other protections do. Which you cannot break his concentration and let the warp in, because the aegis does not require sustained conscious concentration to maintain. It is woven deeply enough into his psychic architecture that it self-sustains at a level below ordinary conscious effort. This distinction matters enormously for understanding how 10,000 years of continuous exposure to the worst the warp can produce has produced zero failures. It is not that the Grey Knights are particularly strong-willed in a way that ordinary people are not. It is that the thing protecting them does not depend on willpower in the first place. A sufficiently determined demon, given enough time, can find a way to tire even the strongest will. It cannot tire a structural feature of someone's biology. Those are fundamentally different kinds of challenges to address. Is the aegis armor, the silver-grey ceramite, left unpainted as a statement of the desire for absolute purity, is woven through with psychoconductive filaments, a lattice of psychically active circuitry that interfaces with this internal ward and amplifies it. The armor's ritual blessings are not merely symbolic gestures. They are literally functional psychic enhancements, anointed and inscribed and consecrated in ways that allow the armor to channel a portion of the warrior's psychic might through its surfaces, turning the whole suit into a resonating array that extends and strengthens the aegis he generates. Every inscribed litany, every purity seal, every carved symbol and engraved prayer, they are all nodes in a system that turns a Grey Knight's very presence into something hostile to the Imperium. And what this means in practice is something no mere physical description fully captures. To be near a Grey Knight is, for a creature of the warp, a demon, a possessing spirit, even a corrupting whisper trying to find purchase in a nearby mind, physically painful, not metaphorically uncomfortable, actually painful. The Grey Knight's presence burns them. His aegis pushes against their nature, against the fabric of what they are. in a way that is not unlike pressing a demon against a surface of consecrated silver and holding it there. The Grey Knight does not have to do anything to hurt them. He simply has to exist nearby. And this is the point at which the Grey Knights become fundamentally different from every other Astartes in the Imperium. A regular space marine, however faithful, however strong in his devotion to the Emperor, and is ultimately a vulnerable soul in very good armor. His faith is a shield, and it is not a trivial one. The 40,000 universe takes faith seriously as a protective force. But it is, metaphorically speaking, a shield that he holds up. He must maintain his grip. He must sustain his belief. He is fighting against the current. The Grey Knight's faith has been turned into engineering. It has been made physical, made literal, made into something that does not require the conscious act of belief to function, because it has been woven so deeply into what he is that it generates itself. He does not choose to be protected. He is protected because the architecture of everything he has been made into prevents the alternative. There is one more element of training worth mentioning, a one that illuminates how the Grey Knights think about themselves and their work. When a Grey Knight falls badly enough in battle that he cannot return to full function, when his wounds are so extensive that only interment in a dreadnought can preserve his consciousness, he does not want it. Other chapters treat dreadnought interment as an honor, a continuation of service, a chance for their greatest veterans to keep fighting even beyond normal death. The Grey Knights refuse this framing. They want to be taken to the crypts beneath the temple of the Emperor on Titan and laid to rest with their brothers. They want the peace of genuine ending. This reveals something important about the people beneath the silver armor. They are not warriors who love war. They are people who have taken on a terrible burden because it must be borne, who have given up their names and their memories and their pasts in service of something they believe in absolutely, and who carry the weight of that service with them through every campaign. They do what they do not because they find glory in it, but because they are the only ones who can. And they look forward, quietly, to the day when it is done. Now let us talk about incorruptibility, not just the claim of it, but the actual philosophical substance of it. What does it mean for a soul to be incorruptible? And is the specific kind of incorruptibility the Grey Knights possess the same as the kind the Imperium often assumes it to be? The Dark Gods corrupt in many different ways, and understanding this is essential to understanding what the Grey Knights are actually protected against. As the most dramatic form of corruption is the obvious one, the warrior who stares into the abyss and finds something staring back that he likes, who begins making small concessions and then larger ones, who one day removes the aquila from his armor and replaces it with an 8-pointed star. This form of corruption, conscious, chosen, self-aware, is actually relatively rare in the lore because it requires a specific kind of ambition or despair or pride to take root in. More common and far more insidious is the kind that does not announce itself, the whisper that arrives as a reasonable thought, the vision that feels too true and too beautiful to be false, the emotion, pride, grief, rage, despair, love, longing, that a demon presses on like a bruise, making it throb and expand until the person it belongs to has been slowly, or invisibly, transformed without ever making a decision they would have called corrupt. The World Eaters did not choose to become what they became overnight. Angron's rage was amplified by the nails in his skull over decades. The Word-bearers did not suddenly embrace chaos. They were guided through a process of spiritual reorientation that presented each step as reasonable and the next step as the obvious conclusion of the last. The Grey Knights are protected against all of this. The psychic training and the aegis together do something more than just resist incoming attacks. They teach the warrior to recognize these mechanisms in real time, to see the whisper as a whisper, to recognize the offered vision as a vision rather than a truth, to know the shape of the seduction before it completes itself. And they have spent so long studying how corruption works, from the inside of the discipline that understands it best, that they know its grammar, its vocabulary, its favorite opening gambits. And knowing those things, they cannot be deceived by them. There is a further argument in the lore, more speculative but compelling, that the aegis does something even more profound. It may prevent the deep warp resonance that makes corruption possible in the first place.
Look, I want to stop here for a second and just be honest with you about where I personally land on all of this, because I think it matters. When I first went deep on Grey Knight's lore, my gut reaction was skepticism. 10,000 years, zero corruption, perfect record. That sounds like propaganda. That sounds like the kind of thing the Imperium prints on a banner and hangs in a hole somewhere. But the more time I spent with it, the more I came to appreciate that the writers at Games Workshop actually did the work. They did not just declare the Grey Knights incorruptible and move on. They built a biological, psychological, and spiritual architecture around it that holds up under scrutiny. And then they added stories like Saden and Drago specifically to stress it. That to me is good lore writing. Not because it gives you easy answers, but because it earns the extraordinary claim it is making. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Every psychic entity, every psyker, every warp-touch creature, every human who spends time in the presence of the Imperium leaves a kind of signature in the warp, a frequency, a flavor, something that the warp's inhabitants can sense and respond to. Demons follow these signatures the way predators follow scent trails. Each corruption typically begins with a demon noticing a frequency it can match, a resonance it can amplify, and starting to hum along with it in ways the target does not immediately detect. The aegis may not just be a shield against incoming warp influence. It may actively emit a frequency that is actively hostile to this process. Not just a locked door, but a door built from a material the key cannot touch. Not just a silent room, but a room filled with a sound that drives away the listeners. The Grey Knight's psychic presence, maintained and shaped by the aegis, may fundamentally interfere with the mechanisms that corruption requires to begin. This is a powerful protection. This is truly extraordinary. But here is the crucial thing, the thing that Saden's story reveals. This protection was built against a very specific threat. It was the architects of the Grey Knights, the Emperor and Malcador, who together possessed the deepest understanding of chaos and the warp of any beings who had ever lived. Designed the aegis and the gene seed and the training to protect against chaos specifically, against the ruinous powers, against the dark gods and their servants, and the spiritual corruption that pours out of the Imperium. They built the best possible lock for the specific door they were most worried about. But the universe contains other keys within the Grey Knights themselves, and this is important for understanding exactly what makes Saden's case so significant. There is a hierarchy of purity, not of power, not of skill, but of this particular quality that the chapter prizes above all others. At the top of that hierarchy sit the purifiers. The Order of Purifiers is one of two elite brotherhoods within the Grey Knights chapter, alongside the Paladins. Where the Paladins are selected for exceptional skill and valor, qualities that can be developed through centuries of fighting and training, the Purifiers are chosen for something different. Something that cannot be manufactured, something that either exists in a warrior or does not, and which no amount of training can produce in someone who was not born with the seeds of it. The purifiers are chosen for the quality of their souls. This is not a metaphor. This is not a matter of attitude or loyalty or devotion, all of which can be deepened by the right experiences. This is something more fundamental, a quality that the Grey Knights describe in their own records as a kind of burning. It's not the fierce burning of a warrior's passion or the cold burning of fanatical devotion, something more interior than that. Something that lives in the purifier's psychic presence the way heat lives in an ember, quietly, constantly, without requiring anything special to sustain it. In the presence of a purifier, the taint of chaos withers, not because the purifier is actively attacking it, not because he is performing some specialized ritual or channeling a particular power, simply because he exists nearby. The dark taint of warp corruption finds his presence actively hostile in a way that goes beyond what even other Grey Knights achieve. He is, to chaos, something like an antibiotic introduced into a culture, not just resistant to the thing being fought, but but actively destructive of it by his mere presence. As the selection process for purifiers is extraordinarily rigorous even by Grey Knight standards, which itself tells you something about the bar being cleared. A Grey Knight can serve his chapter for centuries, for generations in some cases, achieving everything that a Grey Knight can achieve, fighting battles that would be the defining moments of any other warrior's career, accumulating honours that would fill several lifetimes' worth of service records, and never be invited to join the purifiers, because the quality the purifiers look for is not measurable in battles won or demons banished or years served. Either the soul burns with that particular flame, or it does not. The result of this selectivity is that at any given moment, there are never more than 40 to 50 purifiers in the entire chapter, 50 warriors, out of a chapter of roughly 1,000 who meet the standard. 50 people in all the Imperium of mankind who have been assessed and confirmed to carry the specific quality of soul that makes a purifier what they are. They serve as the spiritual heart of the chapter. They stand guard over the chamber of purity in the citadel of Titan, the innermost sanctum where even most Grey Knights cannot go without permission. They form the spearhead of assaults into the most deeply corrupted environments, the places so saturated with warp energy that even veteran Grey Knights can feel the weight of it pressing in. The purifiers feel nothing of that weight, or rather, they feel something different, not the pressure of being pushed against, but the offence of wrongness, but the visceral contempt of someone who finds the very existence of corruption an insult to the universe. Their demeanour reflects this. Sources describe them as dour and taciturn, their eyes burning with a black fire that borders on fanaticism. Not the fanaticism of someone worked into religious fervour by external stimulation, but something quieter and more absolute, the certainty of someone who has looked at everything dark and terrible and simply found it contemptible. Not frightening, not seductive, contemptible. An insult to what should be. They carry this contempt as a natural state, the way other people carry their names. The Purifier's leader, the Castellan champion, carries one of the most extraordinary burdens in the chapter, the wardenship of the Blade of Antwer, as a demon weapon of significant power, whose bound spirit whispers without ceasing to whoever holds it. Garen Crow has held this responsibility for many years. The blade whispers to him always, endlessly, with the patience of a demon, offering, threatening, promising, cajoling, finding every angle and pressing on it. And it has received from Crow nothing but silence and contempt since the day he took up the burden. Not suppressed emotion, not grim endurance, genuine indifference, the way you might be indifferent to a very persistent insect that you know cannot reach you. The fact that even this, holding a demon weapon that never stops trying to corrupt its bearer, does not trouble a purifier, tells you precisely how different these warriors are, even among their own extraordinary peers. So when the Grey Knights received word that the purifier ship Blade of Purity had gone dark and silent, drifting without communication in the void, and when the first assessments of the available evidence suggested that something had happened aboard that ship that should not have been possible, the response within the chapter was not merely concern. It was something closer to the particular, cold dread that comes from confronting a possibility your entire worldview was built to exclude. If this had happened to a purifier, what did it mean? Before we get to the answer to that question, we need to spend a little more time with the specific geography of the chapter's inner world, because the purifiers do not exist in isolation. They exist in relationship to everything else the chapter has built. And understanding that relationship makes their particular vulnerability more comprehensible. Within the chapter's command structure, the purifiers occupy a curious position. They are elite, certainly. Their spiritual quality makes them the chapter's most specialized weapon against the most corrupt environments. But they are not the chapter's commanders, not primarily its tactical minds, not the people who make the strategic decisions about where and how to deploy the chapter's resources. Those responsibilities fall to the Grand Masters and the Chapter Master. The Purifiers are not a command tier, they are an instrument. This means that their deployment is controlled by people who are themselves extraordinary warriors, but who do not necessarily share the Purifier's specific spiritual quality. And a Grand Master is extraordinarily resistant to chaos, certainly. All Grey Knights are. But a Grand Master's selection criteria included tactical brilliance, leadership ability, and centuries of proven service, not specifically the soul fire of a Purifier. A Grand Master deploying Purifiers to the Blade of Purity for whatever mission brought them there was not deploying them with the same kind of soul-level insight that the Purifiers themselves bring to their work. He was making a tactical decision based on information available to him. This is relevant because the Blade of Purity's fate suggests that whatever sent those Purifiers into that situation may have underestimated the nature of what they were sailing into, not the chaos content. The Purifiers could handle whatever chaos content existed there, but the biological content is the Genestealer nest that no one had assessed the scale of before the ship was dispatched, the threat that the tactical briefing did not adequately prepare for, because the Genestealer's psychic mechanism is simply not part of the threat matrix that the chapter's standard assessments are optimized to identify. In other words, the system worked. The Purifiers held against everything they were built to hold against. The system's gap was not in the warriors, but in the intelligence gathering that put them in a situation their extraordinary protections could not fully address. Let us walk through what actually happened aboard the Blade of Purity, because the audio drama that tells this story, Incorruptible, written by David Annandale, released as part of the Blade of Purity collection, is a very good piece of 40k fiction. And it deserves to be understood in its full context, rather than just summarized at arm's length. The story follows Grey Knight's Justicar Styre and his squad. They have been operating in the Sanctus Reach before this assignment, fighting the plague-ridden servants of Nurgle, the most physical and entropic of the Dark God's expressions, diseases that rot the body and drown the spirit in despair. It is exhausting work. The kind that leaves a residue even on warriors as hardened as Grey Knights, not because of any spiritual corruption, but simply because of the weight of what they witness and what they must do. They are tired in the deep, purposeful way that comes from work that never quite ends. Into this exhaustion comes a new order. Locate the Blade of Purity, a Purifier strike cruiser that has gone completely silent. It's missing in circumstances no one has been able to explain. Last known position tracked down by the Ordo Malleus, but whatever happened aboard it remains a closed mystery. The squad boards the ship, and immediately the atmosphere is wrong in a way that experienced Grey Knights feel before they can articulate. The corridors are dark in a particular way. Not power failure dark, but the dark of a place where something has been extinguished. The air carries a residue of conflict, chemical traces of weapons fired, the unmistakable undertone of blood dried on surfaces, the psychic echo of violence that occurred in multiple locations. Someone fought here, something happened here, and the pattern of it, the distribution of the violence, the direction of the wounds, the way the evidence arranges itself, tells a story that Styre's squad does not want to believe. Someone aboard this ship turned on the crew, and that someone appears to have been wearing Grey Knight armor. The dread this realization generates among Styre's warriors is one of the most effectively written moments in the audio. These are men who have faced greater demons and walked away, who have descended into regions of the Eye of Terror, so saturated with warp energy that reality itself was unreliable, and come out still themselves, who have held the line against things that have no name in any language humanity has developed. They do not experience fear as ordinary people do. But this, the possibility that a Purifier has fallen, produces something in them that functions like fear because it attacks something more fundamental than their physical safety. It attacks their assumptions about the nature of the universe. The Purifiers are the flaw, the absolute, the thing that cannot happen. If this could happen to a Purifier, then nothing is certain. Everything the chapter is built on rests, at some level, on the truth of this claim. If the claim is false, if the truth is that the incorruptibility has always been conditional, always had an edge case that was waiting to manifest, then everything about how these warriors understand themselves and their mission requires revision. They press deeper into the ship. The evidence accumulates. What they fight isolated pockets of resistance, chaos cultists who boarded after the fact, opportunists who found a dark ship drifting and saw salvage, not knowing or not caring what had killed its crew. The cultists are not the answer to what happened here. They are a later arrival. The real story is deeper in, and eventually they find him, Saden. He is moving through the corridors with the wrong gait, not injured, or not only injured, wrong in a more fundamental way, the way a puppet is wrong. The movements are human in their mechanics, but not in their purpose, slightly off in their timing, graceless in a way that a purifier should never be graceless. He is fighting, or rather, the body that was Saden is fighting, but it is fighting with none of the skill that centuries of Grey Knight training should have produced. Steyer notes this explicitly. The way this thing fights, he can hold it off indefinitely without trying hard. The footwork is wrong, the guard is wrong, the attacks are clumsy and predictable, and lack the particular quality of a trained warrior's intuition. Whatever is using Saden does not know how to use him properly, because whatever is using Saden is not a demon. It is not a chaos entity. It is not any of the things a purifier's soul should be able to resist and drive back through the sheer force of his spiritual nature. It is the hive mind. The blade of purity had not fallen to chaos at all. What had taken the ship was a genestealer nest. Somewhere between 60 and 80 of them, a large group by any standard, was the kind of numbers that can overwhelm almost anything through attrition and the collective psychic pressure of their shared biological consciousness. They had gotten aboard through means the audio does not fully specify, had found the purifiers in circumstances that negated some of the usual advantages, and had proceeded to decimate the squad through the oldest and most reliable method available to any enemy of the Grey Knights: overwhelming numbers and relentless biological ferocity. Most of the purifiers died fighting, properly fighting, resisting to the last with everything they had. Their bodies, scattered through the corridors, tell that story in the record of their wounds. They were not taken without costing the enemy greatly, but the nest had the numbers to absorb the cost, and at the end of it, one purifier was still alive. While Saden and the hive mind operating through the collective psychic might of the surviving genestealers, that vast, alien, biological intelligence that the Tyranids project ahead of themselves like a psychic shadow that can reach into the minds of entire planetary populations and dissolve their will before the fleets arrive, reached out and took him, not through corruption, not through seduction, not by finding a crack in his aegis or a shadow in his soul or a wound in his past that could be pressed open. The hive mind does not operate through any of those mechanisms. It does not offer or tempt or whisper. It simply reaches and grabs, using a form of psychic force that is more mechanical than spiritual, more biological than theological, the way a crushing weight does not ask permission before it crushes. And Saden's soul was not corrupted. His spirit was not broken in the way that chaos breaks its victims, but his nervous system was seized. His body was turned into a tool. His mind, whatever remained of it behind the alien occupation of his muscles and bones, was imprisoned in a body it could no longer control, watching itself move toward his brothers, unable to stop. Steyer grants him mercy. The blow is quick, precise, the way Grey Knights do things. The genestealers are exterminated. The chaos cultists are dealt with. The ship is recovered and will be reconsecrated. The chapter goes on. And somewhere in the carefully maintained records of the Grey Knights, there is an entry for Saden, Purifier, the manner of whose end required descriptions that the chapter's language was not fully prepared to supply, as because he had died of something its architects had not prepared its language for. The community's reaction to incorruptible was divided in ways that are themselves revealing. One camp felt cheated. The premise of the audio, that a purifier might have fallen to chaos, was set up deliberately as the central mystery, and revealing the answer to be genestealers rather than the ruinous powers felt like a narrative dodge, like the writers had posed a fascinating, dangerous question and then answered it with a technical escape hatch. Yes, something terrible happened, but it was not the thing you were dreading. The immunity holds. On a technicality, many fans found this unsatisfying. The other camp, the one I find more intellectually compelling, argues that the technical distinction matters enormously, and that understanding why it matters tells you something truly important about the Grey Knights. Here is the distinction. Saden was not seduced. He was not approached through emotion or ambition or memory. His soul was not offered anything, because the hive mind does not offer anything. The hive mind does not have a concept of individual souls as things to be bargained with or corrupted. It has a concept of nervous systems as things to be incorporated. The mechanism by which Saden was taken is not the mechanism the aegis was built to resist, because it is not a spiritual process at all. It is a biological one. The purifier's soul remained apparently exactly what it had always been, uncorrupted, unbroken, locked away in a body that was no longer his to use, but unbroken. And when Styre killed him, he was not putting down a traitor, but he was freeing a prisoner. Whether you find this satisfying as a story resolution, whether the genestealer explanation feels like a genuine exploration of Grey Knight vulnerability or an escape from the harder question, probably says something about what you came to the story looking for. If you wanted to see the claim tested and found truly wanting, the ending will disappoint you. The claim holds. But I think there is a third reading, and I think it is the most honest and the most interesting one. The Grey Knights are not invincible. They never claimed to be invincible. The claim was always very specific. They cannot be corrupted by chaos. Not that nothing else can hurt them. Not that nothing else can take their bodies, compromise their minds, turn them into instruments of harm. Or just that the specific mechanism of chaos corruption, the one that took 8 Primarchs and uncountable Space Marine legions, and reshapes them into instruments of the Dark Gods, cannot find purchase in a Grey Knight's soul. Saden's story is not evidence that this claim is false. It is evidence that the universe is larger than any single claim. That building, the most impenetrable possible defense against one specific threat, does not mean you are protected from everything. That even the most carefully designed fortress has walls facing in the wrong direction to catch some particular approach. The Grey Knights were built to resist chaos. They resist chaos, completely, reliably, over 10,000 years without a single exception. And a genestealer nest still took one of them down, because genestealers are not chaos. And the lock that stops the warp's key does not stop a biological key of alien manufacture. That is frightening in a way that cuts deeper than corruption would. Corruption would mean the Grey Knights had been reached, had been found, had been understood well enough by the enemy to be undone. Saden's death means something else, that the universe contains threats that operate by principles the architects of the Grey Knights had not fully accounted for, and that even the finest, most precisely engineered protection in the Imperium has blind spots. But Saden is not the only pressure test the Grey Knight's incorruptibility has been put through. There is another example, far more famous, far more debated, philosophically much more challenging, that requires significant attention of its own. His name is Kaldor Drago, and his story begins the way all the best Grey Knight stories do, with something that should not have been possible, done because there was no one else to do it. Drago's early career was distinguished by the battle on Akralim, where as a battle brother of the Third Brotherhood, he faced the demon prince Makar the Reborn and banished it. A significant accomplishment for any warrior, let alone a relatively newly made Grey Knight. Makar was not pleased. As it was driven back into the warp, it laid a curse on the young warrior. If Drago ever set foot on the soil of Akralim again, he would walk with damnation, and the curse would extend to all who followed him. Drago, at this point in his career, was busy enough that the curse was not his immediate concern. He continued fighting. He rose through the ranks of the chapter, as accumulating a reputation for both strategic brilliance and the kind of personal ferocity in close combat that people talk about in long years afterward. He became a Justicar, he became a Grand Master, and then, in 901 M41, during a terrible battle at a place called Cornovin, his chapter faced Mortarion. Mortarion, Daemon Primarch, traitor son of the Emperor, Lord of the Death Guard, champion of Nurgle's decay and corruption, one of the most powerful beings in the warp. He was there in the flesh, the terrible, changed, immortal flesh of a Primarch who had given himself over to a god and received the full weight of that god's transforming attentions. Drago's predecessor, a supreme Grand Master, a warrior named Geronitan, was trying to perform the rite of banishment, the rite that should have driven Mortarion back into the warp. Which Mortarion killed Geronitan in the middle of the rite. Not just killed, made a statement of it. This is what your greatest can do to mine. This is the gap between us. And then he turned his attention elsewhere, presumably satisfied that the point had been made. Drago had watched his Grand Master die, and his response to this was not grief, not tactical retreat, not a measured assessment of the situation and a considered plan for how to survive it. His response was to throw himself at a Daemon Primarch. He fought Mortarion personally. He hurt Mortarion in ways that should not have been possible for a single warrior against something of that magnitude. He drove the battle to a point of sufficient physical proximity. And then, in an act that the chapter still talks about in tones that mix reverence with something that might be described as delighted disbelief, he carved his predecessor's name into Mortarion's heart. Not metaphorically, literally, into the actual physical, spiritual heart of the Daemon Primarch. Scarred there, permanent. Something that would not fade, that Mortarion would carry forever, that would be there when he pressed his hand to his own chest in whatever dark sanctuary the Plague Planet provides for its master's quiet moments. Mortarion never forgot this. In the ongoing war between the Grey Knights and the servants of Nurgle, there is one specific, personal, deeply held grudge that sits underneath all the other conflicts. And it belongs to a Demon Primarch who has a dead Grand Master's name carved into his heart by a warrior who was angry enough to do it and skilled enough to survive doing it. Drago was eventually elevated to Supreme Grand Master, the 48th by the chapter's reckoning. He led the Grey Knights for nearly a century, accumulating a legend that eventually became one of those characters that divides the fanbase sharply between people who find him inspiring and people who find him exhausting. His deeds grew to include fighting Daemon Primarchs to standstills, walking into the Eye of Terror and coming back, and generally being described in terms that strain credulity even by the elevated standards of 40,000 heroics. But the deed that matters most for our purposes came in 999 M41. It's 200 years to the day after the cleansing of Acrolem, which is the kind of timing that makes you wonder whether the universe has a sense of narrative. Drago was drawn back to that world. Makar had returned. Someone had to deal with it. Drago went, because that is what Drago does. He fought the demon at the edge of a warp rift. The demon shattered his nemesis sword. Drago killed it anyway, drove the broken blade into Makar's heart with the same energy he had once directed at Mortarion's. And Makar, with its final dying breath, invoked the curse it had laid 200 years ago and threw Kaldor Drago into the rift, into the warp, the realm of chaos, the home and substance of the dark gods, the environment that destroys the vast majority of living things that find themselves inside it, the place that corrupts absolutely, has given enough time, given sufficient exposure, the place where chaos is not an external threat, but the very air you breathe, and the ground beneath your feet, and the sky above your head, the place from which no ordinary mortal can expect to emerge still themselves. And Kaldor Drago has been there ever since, walking it, fighting the things he finds there, carving the names of fallen Grey Knights into the hearts of greater demons he defeats, apparently out of habit at this point, occasionally finding his way back into real space during moments of particular crisis, drawn through by circumstances or by the weakening of reality's barriers that the formation of the Great Rift brought about. to fight briefly alongside his chapter before the warp reclaims him. He has been there, in subjective terms, for what might be centuries by now. The warp does strange things to time, and Drago's accounts of his wanderings suggest that the amount of subjective experience he has accumulated in the Imperium goes far beyond a century's worth of real space-time. He has seen things in there that no mortal mind was designed to process. He has survived encounters that should have killed him a dozen times. He has been alone in the most hostile possible environment for longer than most mortals live, and he has not broken. His loyalty has not wavered. His sanity has not cracked, at least not in any way that the chapter has been able to detect. In his periodic returns to real space, his sense of himself, his identity as a Grey Knight and a servant of the Emperor appears intact. His skill has not degraded. His will has not been eroded by the constant presence of the thing that would most want to erode it. Now, is this a triumph of Grey Knight incorruptibility, or is it something more complicated? The obvious reading is that yes, this is the most extreme proof of the claim. If 10,000 years of service hadn't produced a corrupted Grey Knight, then one supreme Grand Master wandering the warp for subjective centuries and emerging still himself is the ultimate validation of everything the chapter was built to be. The aegis held, the gene seed held. Whatever the architects of the Grey Knights built, it was built well enough to survive this. The less obvious reading involves a few different threads. Some lore suggests that Drago's survival in the warp is not purely a function of his own incorruptibility, but also reflects the fact that the Dark Gods have, in a sense, lost interest in making a concerted effort to corrupt him. He is trapped. He is isolated from his chapter and unable to effectively lead it. Every demon that tries to engage him seriously tends to end up regretting it. From the perspective of the Chaos Gods, who are not stupid and who operate on the basis of what costs them the least while achieving the most, Drago may be more useful to them as a curiosity and a limitation on the Grey Knight's command structure than as a corruption project that would require enormous effort and might not even succeed. This reading does not diminish Drago. It does not say his incorruptibility is fake. It says that the incorruptibility is real, but its continued existence in the most extreme test conditions may be partly a function of the enemy deciding the test isn't worth pressing. There is also the question of what the warp's extended presence actually does to a person who cannot be corrupted. Does the immunity come without cost? Does living for centuries in an environment that operates on principles antithetical to stable human psychology leave no marks at all? The lore is carefully ambiguous here. Drago does not appear to have been changed in his loyalties or his essential nature, but whether the experience has left other kinds of marks, stranger, subtler, harder to categorize as corruption or as something else entirely, is one of those questions the lore keeps open. What is not in question and what matters for our purposes? That is this. Kaldor Drago is in the warp. He has been there long enough to accumulate subjective centuries of experience. He remains, apparently, himself, and the specific form of corruption that the Dark Gods specialize in has not claimed him. The claim holds, expensively, dramatically, improbably, against all reasonable expectation, but it holds. We have talked about Saden and Drago as the two ends of a spectrum, one who was taken in a way the Grey Knight's immunity did not protect against, and one who wandered through the source of corruption itself and emerged intact. But there is a third chapter of Grey Knight history that is, in some ways, the most important for understanding what these warriors actually are, because it is the chapter where the Grey Knights did something deeply terrible, but not in a way that can be explained away by pointing at the warp or the nature of the enemies they fight, in a way that requires sitting with the discomfort of recognizing that being incorruptible to chaos and being moral are not the same thing. The year is 444, M41, the first war for Armageddon. Armageddon is a hive world, a planet of industrial machinery and vast urban sprawl, of smoke and steel and the ground-down humanity that keeps the Imperium's war machine running. The kind of world that produces soldiers the way other places produce food. in enormous quantities, under conditions that would break anyone less conditioned to hardship, with a grim pragmatism that has no room for sentiment. Into this world descends Angron, once a Primarch, once the master of the World Eaters Legion, a tragic figure in many ways. As a man who had been subjected against his will to rage-amplifying implants called the Butcher's Nails before the Emperor even found him, who had fought with the desperate fury of someone who had been in constant neurological pain since adolescence. Now a demon Primarch, Khorne's most beloved champion, a being of absolute slaughter elevated to divine status by a god whose entire existence is the sanctification of bloodshed. He descends on Armageddon with 100 daemon cohorts and the intention of bathing the world in enough blood to satisfy even his patrons. The response from the Imperium is, for once, swift and substantial. The Space Wolves answer the call. The entire chapter, Logan Grimnar, at their head. An entire company of Grey Knights deploys alongside them. What the Armageddon Steel Legion holds its cities and its walls with the desperate courage of people fighting for their home, and against everything, against Angron and the tide of demons, and the sheer scale of what is being thrown at them, they hold, barely, expensively, at a cost that is almost too terrible to measure. And the final victory is won by the Grey Knights. A small group of them, led by a newly ennobled warrior named Hyperion and his Justicar Gallio, face Angron directly and perform the rite of banishment. It goes badly at several points. Performing a banishment rite against a Daemon Primarch is one of the most demanding things a Grey Knight can attempt, and the price paid in that small group is grievous, but the rite works. Angron screams back into the warp, taking his demon cohorts with him. The war is over. As that is the version of this story that should be celebrated. Loyalists standing together against something that should have been unstoppable. Grey Knights and Space Wolves and the soldiers of Armageddon, fighting the same enemy in the same war, and winning. And then the Inquisition arrives to manage the aftermath. The Ordo Malleus is the institution that the Grey Knights serve as chamber militant. Its Lord Inquisitor at this moment is a man named Gesme Kisneros, and he has been given jurisdiction over the post-conflict period on Armageddon, and his assessment of the situation produces an order that, from a pure inquisitorial doctrine standpoint, is arguably defensible, and from any other standpoint is monstrous. The people of Armageddon have seen things. The civilian population, the soldiers of the Steel Legion, they witnessed demons. They saw what a demonic incursion actually looks like in the streets of their cities. They know that the Primarchs were real, and that some of them fell, and that one of them just tried to drown their world in blood. They have seen the truth about chaos, and in the Inquisition's calculus, knowledge of chaos, the specific, experiential, deeply embedded knowledge that comes from having been in the middle of a demonic war, is more dangerous than the value of the lives that contain it. The order is given: round them up, sterilize the survivors, send them to labor camps distributed across the galaxy, where they will live out diminished lives until they die. Destroy any transport that tries to leave with survivors. Destroy any world that survivors manage to reach. And if the worlds themselves are not viable quarantine targets, there is always Exterminatus, Logan Grimnar, who had fought alongside these people and watched them bleed for their home, and received personal assurances from both the Inquisition and the Grey Knights that most survivors would be spared. Logan Grimnar, who is not a gentle man, but who has a fierce and specific understanding of what loyalty and honor mean, refused, positioned his fleet to shield surviving transports, began actively interfering with the inquisitorial containment operation, and the Inquisition deployed the Grey Knights against him, not against demons, not against traitors, against Logan Grimnar and the Space Wolves, who were protecting innocent civilians from being exterminated for the crime of having survived a war they did not choose. But the fighting that followed, later called the Months of Shame, lasted years and left marks that have never fully healed. Grey Knights' vessels destroyed worlds where survivors had found refuge. Grey Knights' Justicars focusing their collective psychic power to prevent Space Wolf teleportation, were shot in the back when that power made them vulnerable targets. The Glaive of Janus, flagship of the Grey Knights' First Brotherhood, 10,000 years old, built in the chapter's founding years, was lost in the fighting. Nearly 100 Grey Knights died in the conflict, and they named it themselves, not the Inquisition, not anyone else. The Grey Knights themselves looked at what they had been part of and what they had done, and they called it the Months of Shame. They wore the name as an indictment of their own role in it, one as an acknowledgement that something had gone badly wrong with them, not in their chaos immunity, not in their devotion to the Emperor, but in the more mundane and more human matter of following orders that they knew to be wrong, killing people who deserved to live, being used as instruments of something that their own moral sense found shameful. The Months of Shame is essential to any honest understanding of the Grey Knights precisely because it demonstrates that the incorruptibility, the genuine, real, 10,000-year-old resistance to chaos corruption, does not extend to every form of moral failure. The Grey Knights cannot be seduced by the dark gods. They can be deployed by an inquisitor with a mandate and bad judgment to commit atrocities against innocent people, and they will execute those orders because their training emphasizes fidelity to the command structure and because the qualities that make them extraordinary demon hunters, the willingness to treat an objective as an objective, the ability to act without hesitation, the capacity to set aside the weight of individual human tragedy in favor of the mission. These same qualities become catastrophic failures when the mission is wrong. They are incorruptible. They are not infallible. They are not morally perfect. And the Months of Shame is the chapter of their history that makes this distinction most clearly and most painfully legible. It is worth sitting with the specific details of how the Months of Shame unfolded, because the sequence of events reveals a great deal about the specific failure modes of an organization built the way the Grey Knights are built. The Grey Knights in this period were deployed against the Space Wolves, not because the Grey Knights' own command structure had decided this was the right use of their capabilities. They were deployed because the Inquisition ordered it, and the chapter's operational protocols created a chain of deference to inquisitorial command when the Grey Knights are operating in the chamber militant role. The chapter's own internal reckoning, they named the period the Months of Shame themselves, shows that the Grey Knights were not enthusiastic participants. Several of the chapter's warriors were actively conspiring to assassinate Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros before the end, or at having concluded that only his death would stop the spiral toward full civil war between two major imperial institutions. One of those conspirators was the respected Grey Knight Hyperion, the very same warrior whose participation in the banishment of Angron had helped win the first war for Armageddon. Hyperion is an interesting figure in this story because he represents the conscience of the chapter in this period. He fought in the first war for Armageddon with complete commitment and considerable personal cost. He understood, on a level that some of his more institutionally minded brothers struggled with, that what the Inquisition was doing in the aftermath was wrong, not procedurally, not technically, but morally, in the fundamental sense that they were killing people who deserved to live because they had fought well and survived. And he found himself, despite everything his training and his loyalty to the inquisitorial structure suggested, unable to fully comply with orders that he knew to be wrong. He did not refuse them outright. The chapter was not structured for that kind of unilateral refusal, but he resisted where he could, supported the conspiracy where he could, and spent the Months of Shame in a state of sustained moral anguish that the law makes no attempt to minimize. The fact that even one Grey Knight experienced the Months of Shame this way, recognized it as shameful in the moment, not just in retrospect, is significant. It means the Grey Knights are not automata. Their training stripped their memories and rebuilt their personalities around duty and purpose. But it did not remove the capacity for moral reasoning or the experience of moral distress. As Hyperion felt what was being done was wrong, he felt it clearly enough to consider participating in the assassination of the Inquisitor responsible. He just also felt bound by structures he could not simply set aside. This is what makes the Months of Shame more interesting than a simple story of corruption or failure. It is a story of the gap between knowing something is wrong and being able to stop it when the mechanisms that prevent you from stopping it are the same mechanisms that make you effective in the first place. The Grey Knight's value to the Inquisition comes precisely from their reliability, their willingness to execute orders without the kind of moral negotiation that might make other warriors refuse in situations where refusal would be useful. When the order is right, this is exactly what you want. When the order is wrong, it is catastrophic. Nobody designed the Months of Shame. Nobody wanted it. Not the Grey Knights, not even Kisnaros, who appears to have actually believed he was acting in accordance with the Imperium's best interests, even as he oversaw the deaths of billions of innocent people. The catastrophe emerged from the gap between the individual moral reasoning of warriors, who could see the wrongness of what they were doing, and the institutional structures that prevented them from acting on that reasoning fast enough to prevent the worst of it. That is a tragedy in the classical sense. A bad outcome generated not by malice, but by the collision of legitimate values and structures that were each designed for different purposes, and that, in this specific configuration, produced something terrible. Thus, the Grey Knights did not fall to chaos in the Months of Shame, but they fell to something, and whatever it was, it left a mark that 10,000 years of fighting demons has not fully cleaned away. Now let us ask the question directly. All of the evidence on the table, all of the threads pulled. Can a Grey Knight actually fall? The community has settled into roughly 3 positions on this, and each of them has something real to recommend it. The first position says, no, and the evidence supports this. 10,000 years, not one single exception. Saden was taken by genestealers, not corrupted by chaos. Drago is in the warp and has not broken. The Months of Shame was terrible, but it was not corruption. The claim holds completely in the specific terms in which it was made. The Grey Knights are incorruptible to chaos. This is a statement of fact, not aspiration. This position is accurate. It is also somewhat narrow, and its narrowness is part of what makes it feel incomplete as a full picture of the Grey Knights. The second position says, the lore keeps dancing around this question. Saden happened. Incorruptible was literally titled that as an ironic framing. Drago's story pushes the boundaries of what incorruptibility looks like in practice, until it starts looking more like invincibility than genuine tested resistance. And every generation of writers returns to the premise of, what if a Grey Knight could fall, as a starting point, which suggests that even the people writing the lore find the absolute immunity to be a limitation they want to test. This position says the writers are building towards something. There is merit to this. The story of the Grey Knights since the 5th edition Codex, the Matt Ward era, controversial in many directions, established the incorruptibility as absolute almost to a frustrating degree. Every later story that takes the Grey Knights seriously as protagonists has involved finding ways to test that absoluteness without actually breaking it. Saden, Drago, the Months of Shame, stories that ask, what does incorruptibility cost? What does it look like under maximum pressure? What happens when the thing you cannot be corrupted by finds a way to hurt you anyway? The third position, the one I find most satisfying, and the one I think the lore itself most closely supports, is this. The Grey Knight's incorruptibility is real, and it is deeply meaningful, but it is a very specific, the very narrow thing that has been misrepresented as a broader quality than it is. They cannot be corrupted by chaos. This is a profound, extraordinary, authentic feature of what they are. But it is a tool designed for a specific purpose, not an all-encompassing spiritual perfection. Saden's story is not evidence that the tool is broken. It is evidence that the universe is larger than any single tool's design parameters. Saden proved that the Grey Knight's chaos immunity functions exactly as advertised, and that there are things in the galaxy that do not engage through the mechanisms the immunity was built to stop. Drago's story is not evidence of invincibility. It is evidence of what genuine, deep, tested incorruptibility looks like when pushed to its absolute limit, and the picture it presents is not comfortable or triumphant. Yet it is a man walking alone through the worst possible environment, sustained by something he carries in his bones, fighting because he does not know how to stop. The months of shame is not evidence of corruption. It is evidence that being incorruptible to the warp's specific persuasions does not make you wise, does not make you righteous, does not prevent you from being part of something terrible through a combination of institutional loyalty, the dehumanizing logic of acceptable losses, and the specific psychological profile of warriors trained to complete objectives without letting the weight of individual tragedies interfere with the mission. Put all three together, and what you have is a chapter that is exactly as extraordinary as it claims to be in the dimension it was built to be extraordinary in, and exactly as limited as anything built to a specific purpose in every other dimension. There is something else worth noting here, something that comes up in the lore, but does not always get the attention it deserves: the Grey Knight's own awareness of their limitations. They are not oblivious to what they are. They have had 10,000 years to think about themselves, to examine the conditions of their existence, to wonder about the things their extraordinary construction does not protect against. The librarians of the chapter, the psychers who specialize in the theoretical and philosophical aspects of their craft, spend considerable time on questions that sound almost theological from the outside. What is the aegis really? Is it a function of the gene seed, or of the training, or of some combination of elements that produces an emergent quality neither alone could generate? If it is training dependent, can it be trained away from, eroded by specific kinds of exposure that the training did not account for? If it is gene seed dependent, are there conditions that could theoretically compromise the gene seed's function? These are not merely academic exercises. They are professional assessments. The Grey Knights fight an enemy that thinks on cosmological timescales and has the patience to pursue strategies that might take millennia to come to fruition. Knowing the theoretical limits of your own protection is not a weakness. It is the kind of self-knowledge that makes you harder to blindside. Should the fact that they are asking these questions, and have been asking them for 10,000 years, is part of why the protections have held. Complacency is exactly what sophisticated opponents exploit, and the Grey Knights make a conscious practice of not being complacent about what protects them. This self-examination extends to the question we have been circling throughout this whole discussion. The Grey Knights know that Saden was taken by something that their immunity did not protect against. They know that Drago's survival in the warp is not guaranteed by anything other than whatever he himself is made of, and that his situation has no precedent to draw on. They know that the months of shame represents a way that the chapter can be used badly, that the chapter's own internal ethics found deeply wrong. And all of these things are in the archives. All of them are studied. Whether the chapter has developed specific mitigations for the Genestealer-type vulnerability that took Saden, improved early detection, specific protocols for environments where Tyranid presence is possible, enhanced psychic screening for hive mind influence rather than warp influence, the lore does not explicitly say. But the chapter's operating principle is that every mission teaches something, and what the Blade of Purity taught was a lesson about a gap in the threat assessment framework. You would expect the chapter to have learned from it. This is another thing that makes the Grey Knights more interesting than their reputation as simply the incorruptible ones sometimes suggests. They are not static, they adapt. Shouldn't they study their failures as carefully as they study their enemies? They are, in the truest sense, professionals, and the mark of a true professional is not that they never encounter something they cannot immediately handle, but that when they do, they figure out why and build that knowledge into their next preparation. This is what makes them interesting, not the invulnerability of the claim, but the precision of it. They are one thing. Absolutely. They cannot be corrupted by chaos. In 10,000 years, the ruinous powers have never found the key to Grey Knight souls, and the current state of the lore suggests they never will. That is real. That is earned. That is worth the weight it is given. But the universe is not only chaos, and the Grey Knights, for all their extraordinary preparation, are only as complete as their architect's understanding of every possible threat. And even the Emperor and Malkador, with all their accumulated wisdom, could not have anticipated everything. No one can. Before we get to the final philosophical accounting, there is one more dimension of the Grey Knights that we have not fully explored, and it matters for understanding why the incorruptibility claim is something the chapter takes as seriously as it does, rather than simply a piece of institutional pride. It is the dimension of secrecy. The Grey Knights are not merely secret in the way that special operations units are secret. They are secret in a way that has no real parallel in the rest of the Imperium. And the lengths they go to in order to maintain that secrecy reveal something important about how they and the Inquisition they serve understand the nature of their work. Start with this. Space Marine chapters, in general, are not hidden. They are celebrated. The Ultramarines are one of the foundational institutions of the Imperium, their blue armor recognized across thousands of worlds. The Blood Angels are legend, their red and gold the subject of devotional art in 100 different cultural traditions. The Space Wolves are sung about in sagas on 100 recruiting worlds. The Imperium's relationship with its Space Marines is, in general, one of open reverence. These are humanity's demigod protectors. People are supposed to know they exist, that knowing is part of what they do, part of what they are for. Us, the Grey Knights, are the complete opposite of this. Their existence is classified at the highest levels of inquisitorial secrecy, not simply restricted in the way that their deployment details or mission parameters might be restricted. The fact that they exist at all is itself classified. If you encounter a Grey Knight and survive the encounter, you will not be allowed to remember it. Other Space Marines who see them in action are telepathically scoured afterward, their memories of those specific encounters carefully removed, replaced with hazier recollections that attribute whatever they witnessed to Astartes of an unknown chapter, using unusual tactics and armaments. Regular soldiers who fight alongside them are executed after the fact. Entire guard regiments have been put to the sword to prevent the knowledge from spreading. There is only one exception. The Space Wolves know about the Grey Knights, and they know because of the months of shame. Because you cannot have years of active conflict between two organizations and maintain total secrecy about either of them. The Space Wolves know, and Logan Grimnar intends that they keep knowing, and the Inquisition has had to accept this as the price of ending the conflict, because the alternative was escalating into a war that neither side could win cleanly. Why this level of secrecy? Why is the existence of the Grey Knights itself a classified fact? The answer reveals the Inquisition's understanding of chaos, which is also the Grey Knights' understanding of their own purpose. Knowledge of chaos is dangerous, not in an abstract sense, but in a direct, literal, practically demonstrated sense. The people who learn the truth about the warp, that it is real, that it is responsive to emotion and thought, that the things it contains have names and purposes, and the capacity to act on the material universe. These people are changed by that knowledge. Sometimes they are simply terrified, which is manageable, but sometimes the knowledge becomes a doorway. Sometimes the mere fact of knowing that you can reach out to those powers, that they exist and can be reached, is enough to begin a process that ends badly. The Grey Knights cannot be touched by this. They have the knowledge. They have the complete, operational, practical knowledge of the warp's worst inhabitants, and they carry it without being changed by it, because they were specifically built and trained to be immune to what that knowledge normally does to people. But everyone else, the soldiers, the scholars, the civilians, the Space Marines of other chapters, operates without that immunity. For them, knowing can be the first step towards something much worse. This is why the Grey Knights themselves, when they have fought alongside other forces, must ensure afterward that those forces do not retain the memories. Not because the other warriors are untrustworthy in themselves, but because information has weight, and in the warp, weight attracts attention. A mind full of genuine, detailed, functional knowledge about demons and chaos rituals is a more interesting target to those entities than a mind full of vague half-memories and faith-based reassurances that such things are not real. The secrecy is also, on another level, protective of the Grey Knights themselves. Their greatest weapon is surprise and specialization. They work best when demons and their servants do not know they are coming, do not have time to prepare specifically for what the Grey Knights bring, do not know the specific psychic techniques and rites of banishment that will be deployed against them. The moment the Grey Knights become widely known, the moment every demonic summoner and chaos sorcerer across the galaxy has detailed briefings on their capabilities and their methods, that advantage begins to erode. They are an instrument that must stay hidden to stay sharp. Understanding this secrecy is understanding something important about what the Grey Knights sacrifice that is rarely discussed. Other Space Marines can be proud. They can be celebrated. Their chapters can have histories that are sung about and traditions that are passed down through cultures across the Imperium. The Ultramarines have influenced the military doctrine of a million worlds. The Blood Angels have inspired art and devotion across untold generations. Even the most secretive of the other chapters have a cultural presence, a sense of themselves as known things in the world. The Grey Knights have none of this. They are written out of history by design. The campaigns they fight, the victories they achieve, the sacrifices they make, these do not become stories that anyone is allowed to tell. They do not inspire recruiting posters or devotional hymns. The people they save are then either executed or mind-wiped, which means the Grey Knights cannot even have the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere and someone is alive because of them and is aware that they are alive because of them. They fight, and the fight is classified, and the victories are buried in archives that only their own chapter and the highest circles of the Inquisition will ever read. And the people around them, when they fight, either die or forget them. And they do this for 10,000 years, and will do it for 10,000 more if the Imperium survives that long. That is a particular kind of sacrifice that the incorruptibility does not explain. The gene seed and the aegis and the 666 rituals can protect a soul against the seductions of the dark gods. But the loneliness of doing extraordinary things that no one is ever allowed to know about, the particular psychological weight of a purpose that is by definition invisible to the people it serves, that is something you would think might wear a person down even if the warp cannot. And yet it appears not to, or at least the Grey Knights do not show evidence of being worn down by it in any way that the chapter's leadership considers concerning. They simply endure, they do the work, they protect a humanity that will never know they were protected. There is something almost sad about that, and something almost admirable, both at once, in the way that the best 40k stories tend to hold contradictions without resolving them. Let us look at one more aspect of the Grey Knights that deserves consideration in the context of the corruption question, the Librarium Demonica, and what it means for the chapter that they possess it. The Librarium Demonica is the Imperium's foremost repository of warp lore and demonology. It lives within the depths of the Citadel of Titan, in a place that even most Grey Knights are only permitted to enter, with specific authorization and specific preparation. It contains tens of thousands of tomes, ancient books, data slates, bound manuscripts, captured records, and in some cases artifacts that serve as their own kind of document by existing at all. It is the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of fighting demons, of understanding what they are and how they work, and what they want, and how to stop them. Some of these texts are extraordinarily dangerous. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense of texts that contain militarily sensitive information. Dangerous in the sense that reading them, for anyone without the Grey Knight's specific protections, would be a rapid path to possession, madness, or both. The names of demons, the mathematics of summoning, the metaphysics of binding and banishment, the specific operational details of how various types of warp entities interact with the material world. All of this is here, catalogued, preserved, and accessible to the Grey Knights who need it. Think about what this means for the incorruptibility question. The Librarium Demonica is, in a very real sense, the largest single concentration of chaos-adjacent knowledge in the entire Imperium, outside of the Eye of Terror itself. And every piece of information about chaos that the Inquisition has ever decided was too dangerous for anyone else to possess, it is all here, maintained, used. The Grey Knights read these texts as part of their ongoing professional development. They study them to understand what they are fighting. They reference them when preparing for specific engagements. They train their psychers using lore, drawn from sources that would instantly corrupt anyone else who read them. And the corruption does not come because the aegis, because the gene seed, because the 666 rituals and the memory erasure and the lifelong conditioning have built something in these warriors that can handle this exposure the way a trained physician can handle a pathogen that would kill an unprotected layperson, not because the danger is not real, but because the protection is precisely calibrated to it. This is actually one of the most convincing arguments for the specific nature of the Grey Knight's immunity. It is not a generalized psychic toughness or an exceptional willpower. Those qualities might protect you from many things, but would erode under sustained, direct exposure to concentrated chaos knowledge. The Librarium Demonica tests the immunity continuously, every day, by existing and being actively consulted. And it has not eroded it. The Grey Knights also maintain something else that deserves mention, their collection of warp-sensitive artifacts and demon weapons. This is not just the Blade of Antwyr that Crow carries as an act of wardenship. The chapter holds an arsenal of objects, captured weapons, sealed artifacts, bound demon-tainted items from campaigns over millennia that would be catastrophically dangerous in any other hands. They preserve these not out of recklessness, but out of strategic practicality. Some of these objects can be used against the forces of chaos directly. Some provide intelligence about specific entities or techniques. Some are simply too dangerous to destroy safely, and are therefore held in containment where they can be monitored. The fact that the chapter maintains this collection and has maintained it without incident for 10,000 years, without a single documented case of an artifact converting its keeper, without a single recorded case of a bound demon escaping through the weakness of its warden's soul, is further evidence that the incorruptibility operates as advertised. Well, the chaos-adjacent material cannot find what it would need to find to work. The lock is in place. The door remains closed. There is also the matter of the Grey Knight's specific approach to the warp in combat, because this is another area where they demonstrate, in the most practical possible way, that their immunity is real and not simply claimed. Every Grey Knight Psyker reaches into the warp when they cast. They have to. Psychic power does not come from nowhere. It comes from the Imperium, the spiritual sea that lies beneath and alongside material reality. When a Grey Knight Psyker calls on his abilities, whether that is a blast of focused psychic force, a warding ward, a banishment rite, or one of the more esoteric combat abilities in their arsenal, he is opening a door into the warp and reaching through it. As for almost any other Psyker in the Imperium, this is a transaction with risk. Every time you reach into the warp, you expose yourself. Perils of the warp are not a game mechanic abstraction. They represent the genuine danger of demons noticing that a human mind has opened itself to the Immaterium and reaching back through that opening to take what they can find. The more powerful the Psyker, the louder they ring in the warp when they cast, and the more attention they attract. The Grey Knights ring extremely loudly in the warp when they cast. They are among the most powerful Psykers the Imperium produces. Every one of them, constantly, is doing things with psychic power that should attract exactly the kind of attention that a demonic entity would seize as an opportunity. And the demons cannot exploit it. And because the opening the Grey Knight creates when he reaches into the warp is not a door they can push through. The aegis maintains its integrity even while the Grey Knight is actively drawing through the Immaterium. The act of using psychic power does not create the vulnerability it would create in any other Psyker, because the protective architecture of the aegis does not require the door to be closed to function. It extends into the warp itself. It follows the reach. This is, in some respects, the most technically impressive aspect of what the Grey Knights were built to do. They took the fundamental vulnerability of psychers, the necessary exposure that comes with using the one quality that makes them valuable, and engineered a solution. The Grey Knight psyker who is most active in a battle, who is drawing most frequently and most powerfully on the Imperium, is not therefore the most exposed member of the squad. He is protected by exactly the same measure as everyone else, because the protection moves with him into whatever he reaches toward. Think about how difficult that is to engineer. You are not just protecting a person from the outside. You are protecting the act of reaching, the moment of connection, the span of contact between a mortal mind and the most hostile possible territory. The aegis must be, in some sense, bigger than the person who generates it, not just around them, but ahead of them, in the spaces they reach into before the rest of them follows. Whether this was designed explicitly by Malcador and the Emperor, or whether it emerged from the combination of elements they put together in ways they may not have fully anticipated, the lore does not say. But it works. It has worked every single time, in 10,000 years of regular use, against an enemy that is specifically and constitutionally oriented toward finding and exploiting exactly this kind of opening. That is extraordinary. That is the word that keeps coming back when you spend enough time with the Grey Knights. Extraordinary, not in the breathless marketing sense of the word, but in the literal sense. Beyond what ordinary standards of achievement can account for, something that has no precedent and no parallel. Let us revisit Saden one more time, because I think there is something in his story that we have not yet fully drawn out. Something that makes it not just an interesting case study in Grey Knight vulnerability, but a truly moving piece of 40k fiction when you sit with it long enough. Consider what Saden's experience must have been like from the inside. He was a purifier. He had looked at the worst the warp could offer and found it contemptible. He had stood in the chamber of purity and carried out his sacred duty through years and years and years of unbroken service. He had felt the soul fire that the purifiers are selected for burning in him since the earliest days of his service, that clean and particular flame that makes his presence anathema to corruption. He was, in every sense that mattered within the Grey Knight's framework, as as anything the chapter had produced. And then the nest found them. They were killed, one by one, not through corruption, not through seduction, not through any of the mechanisms his training had prepared him to resist. They were killed the way humans kill insects, through numbers and relentlessness, and the simple brute fact of being more. Every purifier on that ship died properly, fighting with the full force of what they were, costing the enemy greatly, except Saden, the last one, and the hive mind reached for what remained. The aegis held against the warp. His soul resisted anything the Imperium might have sent. His training kept the dark gods at arm's length as effectively as it ever had. None of that mattered in the face of the hive mind's particular mechanism, which is not spiritual seduction, but biological override. Check his nervous system, his motor control, his body turned into a puppet while his mind, still himself, still a purifier, still burning with that clean fire, watched from behind eyes it could no longer blink voluntarily. How long was he like that? The audio does not specify, but there is something in the nature of the Genestealer hive mind's possession that does not erase the original consciousness. It does not replace it. It sits on top of it, uses the body as a vehicle, and the person underneath remains present and aware, because the hive mind is not interested in their experience, only in the capability of the nervous system it has commandeered. If Saden was aware of what was happening, and there is every reason to think he was, he spent that period watching himself move toward brothers he could not warn, on performing actions he would never have chosen, unable to stop, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except exist in the horror of a mind that is separated from its own body. For a purifier, whose entire identity is built around the active exercise of spiritual purity and purposeful choice, whose soul burns with the specific quality of someone who has always, in every situation, been able to say no. To be reduced to a passenger in his own body is a particular kind of torment. Styre killed him quickly as he could. that is not nothing. And when Styr looks at the body of his fallen brother afterward, the detail the audio conveys is not satisfaction at having completed the mission or relief that the threat has been neutralized. It is grief, the particular grief of having killed someone who did not deserve to die, as who was not responsible for what was done through his body, who was a victim before he was anything else in this story. The mercy of Styr's kill was real, but real mercy is still painful to extend. The Grey Knights do not leave much room in their culture for this kind of grief. Their training is specifically designed to prevent the attachments that would make loss operationally destabilizing. But the grief is present in the story. Annandale put it there deliberately, and it makes the story something more than a mystery box narrative about whether the impossible has happened. It makes it a story about what it costs to be what the Grey Knights are, and what the universe takes from them despite everything they have given to resist the taking. One final angle on all of this, before we bring it together, the Grey Knights, as they exist now, was in the current lore of the 41st and early 42nd millennium, in the era of the Great Rift and the Indomitus Crusade, and the ongoing catastrophe of the Dark Imperium. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the massive warp tear that now splits the galaxy in half, has changed the conditions the Grey Knights operate in more fundamentally than any event since the chapter's founding. The warp is no longer a danger that can be managed with appropriate precautions and sufficient Gellerfield technology. It is bleeding directly into the material universe at an unprecedented rate. Demonic incursions that previously required deliberate summoning and ritual effort are now happening spontaneously across thousands of worlds. Psychers are more vulnerable than ever. The fabric of reality is thinner than it has ever been since the end of the Age of Strife. In this environment, the Grey Knights are working harder than at any point in their history. The demand for their specific capabilities has never been higher. The number of crises that only they can address is multiplying faster than their relatively small chapter can fully respond to. They are stretched in ways that a chapter of roughly 1,000 warriors cannot sustain indefinitely without taking on losses that are difficult to replace, given the extreme difficulty of their recruitment process. And Kaldor Drago has been emerging from the warp more frequently since the rift opened. Some Grey Knight scholars suggest the weakening of the barrier between real space and the Imperium has also weakened whatever binds Drago to the Chaos Realm, so giving him more frequent windows to step back into the material world. Others suggest something more concerning, that the thinning of reality is making it easier for something to push him through, that his periodic appearances are not escapes but ejections, that forces in the warp have their own reasons for occasionally letting him out. The second reading is darker but more interesting. If Drago is being let out periodically, if the Dark Gods have calculated that brief, crisis-specific appearances by the Supreme Grand Master serve some purpose they find useful, then his incorruptibility is not being tested anymore so much as worked around. He can't be broken, fine. Use him differently. Use the chapter's attachment to him. Use the hope his appearance generates. Use the information his presence provides about where and when the Grey Knights are willing to commit resources. The enemy does not need to corrupt him if they can make his existence useful to them in other ways. This is the kind of strategic thinking the Chaos Gods engage in, patient, multi-layered, accepting failures and converting them into partial advantages wherever possible. And it is precisely the kind of thinking that the Grey Knights' specific immunity does not protect against, because it does not touch their souls. It simply reorganizes the context in which their incorruptible souls operate. The Grey Knights face all of this from their fortress on Titan, that ancient basalt-carved citadel at the base of Mount Anarch, its macro cannons pointed permanently outward, and its existence known only to those who need to know and those who have stumbled into its shadow. The Chamber of Purity still glows with its particular light. The Librarium Demonica still fills its vaulted halls with the accumulated darkness of 10,000 years of documented corruption, understood and used by those who can handle it safely. The aegis still burns in every warrior who walks the corridors. And the question that has been asked across every edition, every story, every late-night fan discussion since the first Grey Knights Codex was printed remains open, not because the answer is uncertain in the specific, precise terms it was posed. In those terms, can chaos corrupt a Grey Knight? The answer is no, and 10,000 years of evidence supports it. But there is something larger that the question reaches toward and never quite resolves. And that larger question is this: in a universe where nothing is absolute, where everything is under pressure, where even the most carefully constructed guarantees operate within limits their architects may not have fully anticipated, what does it mean to say something cannot happen? What does it mean to be incorruptible in a galaxy that is large enough and creative enough and patient enough to find approaches that make the specific quality of incorruptibility beside the point? The Grey Knights hold their answer in the form they can hold it. They burn with the aegis. They keep the watch. They fight demons that should not be fightable, and hold lines that should not be holdable, and maintain a record that should not be possible to maintain. And in the quiet corridors of Titan, where the light is cold, and the prayers are constant, and the names of the fallen are carved into walls that only their brothers will ever read, in that quiet, something that might be called faith sustains itself. Not the faith of people who have never been tested, but the faith of people who have been tested to the edge of what they are, and found that the edge holds. That is not nothing. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is actually quite a lot. There is something deeply correct about 40k as a setting that emerges from sitting with the Grey Knights long enough. The setting does not do comfortable absolute heroism. Even its most heroic figures are heroic in specific directions and limited or broken in others. Even its most carefully constructed protections have edges. Thus, even its most absolute claims have context that complicates them on inspection. The Grey Knights are, in this sense, a perfect 40k faction. They are as extraordinary as they are presented to be, and that extraordinariness exists in a galaxy that is large enough and strange enough to challenge them in ways their extraordinariness does not address. They stand as a specific answer to a specific question, and the galaxy keeps asking other questions. There is a quote I think about in this context, from one of the Grey Knights' own texts, the Liber Demonica, the book that every Grey Knight carries into battle in a ceramite case sealed against corruption. Its exact wording varies across different in-universe sources, but the sense of it runs something like this: the enemies we know are the ones we have learned to face. What the ones we do not know will find us before we find them. The 666 rituals of detestation test for chaos. The aegis is calibrated against the warp. The gene seed of the Emperor provides resistance against the specific forms of corruption that the Dark Gods wield. Every element of the Grey Knight's extraordinary construction is optimized for the enemy the chapter was built to face. But Saden was not tested against Genestealers. The aegis was not calibrated for the hive mind. Whatever quality of the Emperor's gene seed confers its resistance to warp-based corruption does not necessarily extend to biological psychic override. The precision of the preparation, which is the chapter's greatest strength, is also, inevitably, the shape of its blind spots. You cannot test against every possible threat. You can only test against the threats you know well enough to simulate. What the chapter has gained from 10,000 years of experience is knowledge. Not just tactical knowledge, though they have that in abundance. Knowledge about what they are. Knowledge about how they work. Knowledge about what protections they carry and what those protections do and do not extend to. This is how an organization maintains something as improbable as an unbroken record across 10 millennia, not by being invulnerable, but by being rigorous, by learning from every encounter, including the ones that should not have been possible, and building that learning into every subsequent preparation. Saden taught the chapter something. The months of shame taught the chapter something. Drago's continued existence in the warp teaches the chapter something every time he returns, however briefly. The record remains unbroken because the chapter keeps paying attention to the things that almost broke it. and adding those things to the curriculum, and making sure the next warrior who goes into a situation like the one that took Saden is going in with better intelligence and better protocols. That is not the story of invincibility. That is the story of professionals. And in the 41st millennium of human history, in the grim and unending dark, in a universe that will not stop trying to find the gap in every defense and drive something terrible through it, being professional is actually quite enough. Saden stood at the Chamber of Purity's gates for years. He looked at everything Chaos had and found it contemptible. Also, his soul was, by every metric the Grey Knights have developed to measure such things, as clean as anything in the Imperium. And a Genestealer nest took his body because his immunity to the warp's seductions was not immunity to biological psychic seizure. The flame of his soul still burned, probably, even as the hive mind moved his hands. And Styre killed him because that was the kindest thing he could do. It is worth noting, in the quiet aftermath of all this analysis, that Styre's killing of Saden is not recorded anywhere outside the chapter's own classified archives. No one in the broader Imperium knows this happened. No one knows Saden existed. No one knows the Blade of Purity's crew was lost to a Genestealer nest on a ship that was supposed to be one of the most spiritually protected vessels in the Imperium's fleet. The story was classified the moment it was resolved, folded into the chapter's operational records, and sealed behind layers of inquisitorial encryption that only the chapter's own leadership and the most senior members of the Ordo Malleus can access. Somewhere in those archives, there is an entry, a name. Saden, Purifier. The circumstances of his death described in language that strains against what it is trying to say, because the language of the Grey Knights was built to describe enemies of the warp, and Saden did not die fighting an enemy of the warp. He died fighting the instrument that an alien intelligence made of his own body, and no category in the chapter's taxonomy of death covers that cleanly, but the aegis still burns on Titan, the purifiers still stand their watch. When the 666 rituals still break aspirant after aspirant in their search for the rare soul that passes, the chapter still sends its warriors into the darkest places, still banishes demons, still loses brothers to things that should not be possible. The war continues, as it always has, as it will for as long as the warp presses against the material universe. In 10,000 years, no Grey Knight has been corrupted by chaos. Not Saden, whose body was taken by something that had nothing to do with the ruinous powers. Not Drago, who has been walking in the realm of chaos for subjective centuries and is still himself. Not the warriors of the months of shame, whose moral failures were real and costly, but were the failures of training and institutional structure rather than of souls lost to the dark gods. The claim holds. And it is fascinating precisely because of what it costs to hold it, and because of everything it does not protect against, and because the universe does not care how carefully you built your defenses, and will find the angles they do not cover regardless. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and even the most carefully built armor has seams. If this kind of deep, atmospheric walk through the most fascinating corners of 40,000 lore is the reason you came here, then you are exactly the person this channel is made for. The Grey Knights are one of those factions that rewards every layer of depth you bring to them. The more you know, the more interesting the questions become. Not just the painting questions and the tabletop questions, but the ones about what incorruptibility actually means in a universe where everything is under pressure all the time, where even the most carefully constructed promises have edges, and where the thing that finally finds the gap in your greatest defense might be something that your greatest architects never thought to design against. If you want more of this, more slow, careful, immersive exploration of the 40k lore's most interesting corners, the stories and characters and factions that have the most depth to them, then subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss the next one. The bell notification is there if you want to be kept in the loop. And if Saden's story, or Drago's, or the months of shame, left something in your mind that you want to sit with or push back on, the comments are there. Tell me what you think. You tell me whether you believe the claim or whether you think the lore is quietly building toward the day it cracks. Tell me which corner of Grey Knight history you think deserves its own deep dive. The Emperor protects, mostly.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.